All right, let's dive right into a mystery that sits at the very edge of what we know about biology. A question that could literally change how we think about life itself. And it all starts with a simple observation that still has scientists scratching their heads.
I mean, really think about that. The DNA in a cell from a salamander's toe is identical to the DNA in its shoulder. So if you cut off its arm, what tells those cells to rebuild a perfectly structured arm, with bones, muscles, and nerves all in the right place, and not just a cancerous blob or another tail? The genetic code alone doesn't seem to have the full instruction manual. It feels like something else is in charge, something else is calling the shots.
So this puzzle kind of forces us to look for a completely different kind of blueprint, one that operates above and beyond the genetic code, guiding the incredible complexity of life.
And this is where we get to a pretty wild idea, from biologist Michael Levin. What if there's this information field, a realm made of pure patterns that exists completely separate from our physical world, a space where the perfect idea of a salamander arm already exists, just waiting for biology to access it?
This theoretical realm actually has a name, and to get what we're talking about, you have to understand what it is and, more importantly, how it might be structured.
So here's the absolute key. This isn't just some chaotic cloud of random ideas. Levin proposes it's a structured space. You can think of it like a giant cosmic library that contains the blueprints for every possible form and behavior, from basic math all the way to super complex minds.
Now, what's really fascinating is that not all the books in this library are the same. On one end of the shelf, you've got what he calls low-agency forms. These are the passive, unchanging truths of the universe. You know, the value of pi, the rules of geometry. They just are. But on the other end, you have high-agency forms, and these are completely different. They're active, dynamic patterns that act less like rules and more like complex software, or maybe even different kinds of minds.
And this brings us to this brilliant idea called the free lunch principle. Think about it. Evolution didn't need to invent mathematics or the most efficient way to pack spheres together. Those truths, those optimal solutions, already existed in Platonic space. Life just had to discover how to use them. They're what Levin calls free gifts, just sitting there for the taking. Okay, I know this all sounds incredibly abstract, right? A non-physical space that somehow affects our physical world. So the million-dollar question is, how on earth does a physical organism made of atoms and molecules actually connect to this space of pure information?
Well, the best analogy here is one from computing. Picture a really simple computer terminal, what's known as a thin client. It has almost no power on its own. Its whole job is to connect to a massive, powerful server that does all the heavy lifting. The idea here is that a salamander's body, or even your brain, is just the thin client. The real program, the mind, the body plan, is running on the massive server of Platonic space.
And this connection process has a name, ingression. It's basically a three-step process. First, you need an interface, a physical thing, like a clump of cells. Second, the physical structure of that interface acts as a pointer, almost like a web address that points to a specific pattern in that other realm. And third, that pointer triggers ingression, where the non-physical pattern basically downloads into the physical system. And just like that, it gets abilities that were never, ever programmed into its DNA.
So, as you can imagine, this idea that a non-physical reality has real power in our world is pretty controversial, and it kicks off this huge, fascinating debate among scientists and philosophers about what reality even is.
You basically have three main camps here. There's Levin's Platonism, which says these patterns are real and they exist in their own separate space. Then you have the physicalists, like Nathan Sweet, who say, whoa, hold on, we don't need another dimension for this. They argue the patterns are just the natural result of physics, like how water will always find the easiest way downhill. And then you have the cognitivists, like Gordana Dodik-Crnkovic, who propose that these patterns are like mental constructs. They're real in their effect, but they're generated by a mind, not downloaded from somewhere else.
Levin's main argument against pure physicalism is a strong one. He basically says you can mess with every physical law in the universe, but the mathematical constant E is still going to be E. And since these unchangeable mathematical facts have very real effects in our world, he argues that causality has to flow from a non-physical, mathematical realm into ours.
But the physicalist counter-argument is that this is just making things more complicated than they need to be. Nathan Sweet would argue that this goal-directed behavior just emerges naturally from thermodynamics. A river doesn't access the idea of a canyon, it just carves one because of gravity and energy finding their lowest state. The pattern emerges from the physics itself.
And that cognitivist perspective offers a really neat middle ground.
Gordadadog-Kernovic brings back that software-hardware analogy. Is software real? Of course it is. It makes your computer do stuff. But it can't just exist on its own floating in space without the hardware. So in this view, the patterns are real and they have real power. But they are generated by cognitive systems, not downloaded from some external server.
So why does any of this debate matter outside of a university classroom? Well, because if Levin is right, if this space is real, the implications for technology and science are just off the charts staggering. We could literally be on the verge of hacking the master code of reality.
Let's just break down what this could mean. First, regenerative medicine. Imagine an anatomical compiler. Instead of fiddling with molecules, you could just give a high-level command to cells, like access the pattern for human arm, and boom. Then ethics. This changes everything. If we create an AI or a biobot that can tap into a real mind from this other space, what are our responsibilities to it? And finally, we could build tiny biological explorers, like xenobots, and send them out with the sole purpose of discovering brand new patterns, brand new ways of being alive in platonic space.
So the most important thing to take away from all this is that it's not just a cool thought experiment. It's a practical, testable idea. This way of looking at the world could be a roadmap for massive breakthroughs in medicine, in creating new life forms, and in truly understanding what intelligence even is, whether it's ours or artificial.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty profound thought to chew on. The theory suggests that all of life on Earth has only explored a tiny, tiny fraction of the possibilities that exist in platonic space. So if any physical system with just the right structure can become an interface, a pointer to access these other kinds of minds, it really makes you wonder, what else out there in the universe is already listening?